Derek, welcome to the podcast, man.
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
And like I just said off recording, it is a huge honor to have you on the podcast. I sincerely appreciate it. I've looked up to you for many years. I think you've done so many amazing things for the industry. Before we dive in, can you just tell people who you are? Like, who are you? What do you do? Like, give people the intro to Derek.
Yeah, my name is Derek, and I have been a content creator since March 2016. My YouTube channel that primarily focuses around fitness, longevity, quality of life, but also stemmed from roots in bodybuilding, was named More Plates, More Dates, and started when I was a lot younger. And it's kind of just a funny name I came up with when I was younger that I thought was catchy and kind of stuck, and I've stuck with it since. And my interests have evolved over time from the bodybuilding realm to kind of extending into the wellness, anti-aging space, hormone therapy, and preventative medicine as a whole. So how do you go about preventing disease before the onset rather than waiting until you're in a state of poor health to then, take control of your situation. So it's become something I've been very passionate about over the years, especially with what I deem to be a relative lack of access to high quality medical oversight and diagnostics. Especially in Canada, it's quite difficult even not being allowed to pay for certain things even when you want to. And that motivated me to kind of get even deeper in the trenches with this stuff, learn from experts in their fields, and here I am now on podcasts, trying to bring awareness to the masses.
Can I ask, how did you learn? Like, what's your educational background? I mean, are you self-taught? Because dude, you're wildly intelligent. Where does this come from?
I would say the capacity to retain information, I suppose, is just somewhat innate, but I have a business background. I have a undergrad in marketing, actually, all but quite not useful actually for marketing in modern day. I have not really used my education for much, but in terms of health and longevity and wellness and body composition, all that, it's been self-taught through obsession since I was a teenager. When I find a topic that I am highly interested in, I will just bury myself in it until I feel I understand it to the capacity that my interest is kind of peaked at. And fortunately for me, it has extended into many different facets that helps support the health of me, my family, and also hopefully brings education to people at scale now through YouTube and whatnot.
Amazing. All right, so I have a bunch of questions that I wanted to speak to you about, and I believe they were sent to you before we got on. But like I was saying before we got on the call, or before we started recording, my audience is mainly people who want to improve their health. They want to be healthy for themselves, for their families, for their kids. They want to live longer, healthier lives. Yes, they want to get stronger. They want to improve their performance. But it's not generally the group of people that's like, I need to get shredded to bits. I need to have a six-pack. I need to look a certain way. It's just they're not that group, which quite frankly I'm really happy about because I can't stand that group. The people are like, well, I need to track the calories in my broccoli. I'm like, I hate myself talking about this. It's really annoying. So I want to talk to you about something that I've spoken about a lot, and I've had some doctors on. I've had Dr. Spencer Nadolski on, who's been wonderful. I've had Dr. Danielle Bellardo on, who's been wonderful. I want to dive in with you something that I think you're very, very good at, which is analyzing blood work. And first and foremost, could you just talk about why blood work is so important? Like, give an introduction into blood work. Like, what is it? Why is it important? And just give some information on that.
Yeah, I don't think there is a better way currently to get a more informed assessment of systemic health and also subcategorize into different organs and systems in the body. So it gives us a snapshot of time of your current health status and I feel like it is very informative for catching underlying issues, also rooting out deficiencies, inflammation, hormonal imbalances, and oftentimes, if you get it early enough and establish a baseline, you can note aberrations or changes that might otherwise give significant clues to identify the onset of disease before it actually happens, or to identify why you may feel a certain way that is, a general poor state of health can often be rectified via identification of certain biomarkers of, typical ones that are often problematic and identify why you might be in a poor state of health. So I find it very informative for getting very rigorous insights into your current status of health ultimately and how to improve it moving forward.
And I feel like that's probably the least controversial thing anyone could say, regardless of what community they're in, any area of the medical world. If you want to take a deeper look at someone's health, you get blood work done. Yeah. Right? That's now one of the major issues, and we can probably talk about this later on, is sometimes people really struggle to get blood work done. And even if they get blood work done, they struggle to get it analyzed by their doctor. And I'm speaking from personal experience where I've spent literally thousands of dollars to get comprehensive blood panels taken, and doctors wouldn't analyze it, and doctors wouldn't order metabolic panels for me. I would have to go off and do it by myself, which a blessing that I have the ability to do that, but most people don't have the ability to spend that much money and then all the time to try and dive into it. So before we go down that rabbit hole, which will light me up, can you just talk about, and I know in the questions that I sent you, I said 3 to 5, but it doesn't have to be 3 to 5. It could be more. What are some of the most important health markers that you would encourage people to be aware of in their blood work? So if you were getting blood work done for a parent or a sibling or someone that you really cared about for yourself, what blood markers would you pay the most attention to?
Well, one thing I want to make sure I mention as a kind of like a biomarker that is worth mentioning is blood pressure, because I know once I go down the rabbit hole of blood work,
yes,
I'll forget blood pressure entirely. So just first and foremost, I would say that is one of the easiest things to get in check too, because it's very manageable through lifestyle.
On my desk, I have my blood pressure monitor.
Perfect.
Right? I'm so glad you said that, because not enough people talk about it at all.
Yeah. And it's like, I would say probably the lowest hanging fruit, because you can actually assess it at home easily every day and note when your changes are actually impacting the result in real time. And it gives you that feedback too. That's positive reinforcement to continue doing things to continue to move your health forward and whatnot. So with blood pressure, it's like you could have a perfect blood panel, and you might, there could be the argument that you wouldn't have a terrible blood pressure and a perfect blood panel simultaneously because metabolic health, blah, blah, blah. But in general, I've seen guys who have had pretty major issues from unaddressed high blood pressure, despite the fact that their blood work looked pretty solid. So for me,
that's very doable. That's definitely doable, where you could have bad blood pressure but have a good metabolic read, especially like presenting at this moment in time.
Yeah, exactly, because it is ultimately a snapshot in time. So having a blood pressure cuff, it's not a crazy barrier to entry these days. You can get a cuff pretty budget friendly, and it is pretty accurate nowadays too. They track pretty closely with actual physician administered manual readings, pending you don't have a really large or really small arm, at which point you might have to take some more custom measures. But ultimately, having your blood pressure assessed on a regular basis is like one of the easiest, lowest hanging fruit things you can do. So that aside, which is like one of the major contributors to atherosclerosis, which is the leading cause of death in the US, I would say, as far as kind of like the top markers, and I certainly wouldn't want anyone to take this as just get these and then,
right.
Yeah.
This is just like the lowest hanging fruit, like some of the most important. We're not saying this is all you need.
Yeah, I would probably say a complete blood count, so CBC with differential, I think would be totally worthwhile as one of the main. And it's not one, but it's kind of like seen as one biomarker because it encompasses red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and it gives you status into anemia, especially for the women watching, knowing if you are anemic or not, or how close you are to adequate oxygenation of your body. I feel is pretty important for guys, not as typical, but for women, very common, I would say, especially those who have regular periods still. Comprehensive metabolic panel is seen as one marker as well, so I'll put that as the second one. It's kind of a constellation of multiple markers that identifies liver function, kidney health, and overall doesn't give it complete insight into metabolic status, but it's pretty comprehensive as per the name. Fasting insulin, I would say, is pretty strong marker as well, because it can actually get ahead of insulin resistance at the manifestation of it, rather than waiting for failure of the pancreas to actually manage things. So as you get closer to type 2 diabetes, there are later stages whereby you could have caught it earlier if you actually saw your fasting insulin creeping up. Apolipoprotein B, ApoB, I think is kind of the foundational marker for assessing atherosclerosis risk when it comes to what is traditionally seen as, like bad cholesterol. And then I suppose, seeing as it's mostly women probably watching, maybe if you want to say an iron panel, because it's typically consolidated into like a small panel for 10 to $15 or something. I could say iron, but I mean within that there is other markers that are of note, but iron ultimately.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be a solid 5.
Do you think, would it be possible to go through each of these briefly and explain what is happening with each of them, like what it might look like if they're low or if they're high or in a healthy range, what maybe the risks are if they're not in a good range? Can you talk about those?
Yeah, for sure. So when it comes to CBC, essentially, if you were going to differentiate between red blood cells and white blood cells, it's kind of like your ability to carry oxygen to the rest of your body to actually support tissues. And then white blood cells is kind of like fighting disease, immune system. And platelets would be your capacity to clot and stop bleeding. And having an adequate or a balance of all these is pretty critical for not having an overactive or underactive immune system, being able to fight disease, also support adequate daily function, so not feeling lightheaded constantly or fatigued, being able to, walk up a flight of stairs without getting winded. Having adequate oxygenation to tissues is critical, and then ensuring that you're not going to have a stroke or a heart attack or something of that nature that might be caused by excessive, it kind of depends on if you're a male or female. This is more or less prevalent, and also baseline state of health. But in general, this gives a pretty decent insight into where you stand for ability to support tissue oxygenation and immune status. And then CMP, I would say in general, is your ability to, through the kidneys, kind of like filter waste product and whatnot, and the liver to detoxify. So when you see those markers, typically you're looking at AST, ALT, which are like liver enzymes that could indicate damage or a proxy for damage via your body is detoxifying more things, essentially, or having a higher demand for detoxifying. And on the kidney side, there are more granular markers too, but ultimately you're going to be looking at your GFR in particular typically, and it's always estimated because you're not going to do a gold standard inulin clearance, which is like a more rigorous metric, but they have a proxy for that you can get via blood work that is very closely correlated, if not near identical. That is SDMA or cystatin C, and it's a way to calculate eGFR with far greater accuracy. And essentially it's your capacity to filtrate, so ensuring that you have adequate detox capacity in the liver, and then also your kidneys are functioning correctly. If you have low eGFR, it's worth looking into. If you have really high liver enzymes, it's worth looking into. But there are multiple markers in this panel that kind of, in general, there are reference ranges that indicate dysfunction or higher burdens of stress or lower capacity operating kidneys, I suppose. So that is kind of the and also fluid balance and electrolyte balance. I forgot to mention as well, which is critical through the CMP, which can affect a myriad of things in the body. So like sodium, potassium, etc. Fasting insulin, I would say that is kind of like your marker you would defer to see how hard your body is working to maintain glucose levels. So high levels of blood glucose chronically can damage blood vessels, increase inflammation, cause neuropathy at the extremes, weaken the immune system, and ultimately to ensure you're getting enough glucose into cells to support bodily functions. You have insulin, which drives it into these cells. But if you start to develop insulin resistance, you may need more insulin in order to actually rid your blood of the glucose that could be causing these issues from chronic elevations. And over time, if you see this fasting insulin number creeping up and up, you note that you can kind of take from that and extrapolate, oh, my body is working harder than it should to keep things at homeostasis. So, and over time, this can burden your organs and all the things I mentioned from chronically high blood pressure or blood sugar as well. And I think that's kind of like the earliest way to track, is your metabolic health going in a wrong direction as well when it comes to
Interesting.
insulin.
Fasting insulin is like, you think, the earliest detection marker?
I would say probably, because you could note there's a large range, and the blood test reference range that LabCorp has, I would say, is far too lenient when you are looking at it from a fasting context. So it could go up as high as like 20 plus, and it's not going to say you are traditionally high. But if you're looking at this as a fasting number, if you have a chronically 15 plus fasting insulin, you're working pretty damn hard to keep your blood glucose in check to where you can discern with reasonable certainty, I need to improve something when it comes to my capacity to clear glucose, whether it is reducing my carb intake, doing more exercise, building more muscle, like whatever it may be.
Losing more body fat, whatever it is. Yeah.
Sleeping better, like your glucose or insulin sensitivity is dramatically reduced just by having a couple hours less of quality sleep per night. So fasting insulin, I would say, is of the kind of glucose management or identification markers pretty critical. And obviously you could have, go ahead, sorry.
That's super helpful information. And also, and I know you're not done explaining it, but I want to interject really quick in terms of, it brings up the question of, you said the reference range is a little bit bigger than you would like to see. You think that it, and from what I've seen in many instances, not always, but in many instances, people will look at a reference range, like some medical providers or whatever will often look at a reference range, and as long as you're within the range, they're just like, yeah, you're good. But that doesn't, like, if you're tracking your blood, which I think many people don't do frequently enough, but if you're even just getting it annually and you're seeing this trend upwards, even if you're still within the reference range, I feel like, and I have a feeling many, both doctors as well as just everyday people, patients, people who want to improve their health, would get frustrated at the idea of, well, if we're seeing this trend go the wrong direction, even if we're still currently in the healthier range, shouldn't we be addressing it before it gets to the unhealthy range? And I feel like it's a major problem we have, at least from what I see here in the U.S. and speak to my clients about.
Yeah, it's this is kind of where you have to have some proactive approach to managing things on your own before someone calls it out for you, because oftentimes no one will. If you go to a doctor's office and they see if they're even checking your insulin, they often will not say something until your hemoglobin A1C, which is like your average blood glucose over multiple months, is, like pre-diabetic or literally diabetic. And at that point, you've been in a state of insulin resistance for a while. So it's kind of like, well, if I took note of this on my own earlier, I could have gotten in front of it before I had, some level of cardiovascular stress or organ deterioration or what have you, beta cell burnout. So yeah, I think getting a bit more rigorous on the values is of importance, and also having a medical professional overseeing you who understands the nuance, because it can be difficult and overwhelming to evaluate some of this stuff. Fortunately, I think that once you kind of get the hang of these subcategories of blood work, and you see the trends and you see the constellation of factors that leads to the improvements that are actually a lot easier than the otherwise overwhelming, weird, complicated metrics, you kind of realize that there's only so many low-hanging meat and potato things that really move the needle that actually improve all this complicated stuff.
That's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah, like if it helps anybody watching who might feel overwhelmed, like, oh my God, how am I going to remember all these things? Because I even have trouble remembering it oftentimes. And this is like, one of my areas of passion. And doctors, they do too. They oftentimes, even in Marek Health, we have clinical, like webinars where we'll have one doctor host and then talk about all the cutting edge insights into, subcategory of, lab panels. And then we kind of assess all of the new innovations in the works when it comes to being more accurate and proactive, but also get a, refresher on certain things as well to make sure we're all up to date. But
I feel like any logical person would not want to hear a doctor say, "Yeah, I haven't done any research since I've graduated medical school. I don't keep up to date with it. I don't do any research." Like, I think any logical individual knows that you have to stay up to date with it. You have to refresh yourself, and anyone knows that science is always improving and we're always learning more. So we have to keep up to date with it. So hopefully, like I think at least with my parents' generation, like the boomers, they almost just like blanket, like if someone is a doctor, I trust them immediately. And I think with our generation, it's become, there are some really amazing doctors and there are some not so amazing doctors. There's some really amazing police officers. There's some really not so amazing police officers. There's some amazing lawyers and there's not amazing lawyers. Like, regardless of your profession, there are good ones and bad ones. And you always have to do your best to stay up to date with what's new and coming out to give your clients, your patients, whatever, the best service they can get.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and I guess that brings us to ApoB, I suppose, which is kind of, I feel like, a not commonly enough assessed marker. And fortunately, it's not that it's more complicated to understand. It actually simplifies things a lot, because on a lipid panel, typically you will see LDLC, HDLC, VLDL. Like, you'll see a bunch of different DL numbers, essentially, or DLC numbers, and they are each different lipoproteins and the cholesterol within them. And ApoB kind of encompasses all of the low density atherogenic, meaning have a propensity to cause atherosclerosis. Can kind of encompass
what is atherosclerosis for anyone who does, like, can you just explain that briefly?
Yeah, so it's kind of like, I'm sure a lot of people are probably familiar with plaque in the arteries, and they've heard of, if you have too much plaque, it can cause a stroke or what have you. The manifestation of that happens over years, and it is the deposition of these lipids in the arterial wall over time, and that happens via these like atherogenic lipoproteins. So when you hear of, LDLC, that's the bad one. It is one of the bad ones, but it is only called the bad one because it can lead to this deposition that can turn into plaque, and subsequent to that cause blockages and whatnot. So
Understood. Okay.
yeah. So ApoB is kind of a simplified metric that not only actually takes all of the particles that can cause this to manifest and accumulate, and it adds them all together essentially into one metric that reflects total atherogenic burden potential. So like the amount of atherogenic particles in your blood, and that level represents like the LDLC, VLDL, LP little a, and kind of gives you a comprehensive one metric that defines, this is your level that to whatever extent your genetic predisposition, lifestyle, etc., causes that ApoB, how problematic will it become is dependent on a bunch of different things. But ultimately, this is the number that dictates this is your potential for plaque in the arteries over time. So the higher level typically will track with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease over time because there's more potential for plaque to accumulate from that number. So that number I think is pretty critical to oversee and kind of be aware of because it is ultimately the leading cause of death in the States is atherosclerosis, and it is also probably the most avoidable as well through management of blood pressure as well as the management of lipids if warranted, sometimes through just diet and lifestyle, but sometimes through pharmacology as well. And by that, I mean actual medications. So managing that, or at least having a baseline to see where you stand and kind of what your risk profile is. And then with that, with your medical provider assessing, okay, my family history of cardiovascular disease is fill in the blank. How aggressive should I be, or lack thereof, to managing this? Should I implement more fiber in my diet? Should I do more steps? Should I actually take a medication? That's where you work with a provider for a more nuanced interpretation. But that number gives you the snapshot of in your blood right now, this is your potential for plaque accumulation over time should it sustain this level. So I think that's a pretty critical one. And then I suppose for the women, typically I wouldn't say for men iron is like a critical fifth marker, but I think for women it's probably worth noting because it's vital for red blood cells to carry oxygen through the body, and deficiency leads to anemia, impairs physical cognitive performance, and symptoms are pretty apparent. Like when it comes to ApoB, you can't feel when you have high ApoB. Like one day you might have cardiovascular disease and then you'll feel it, but I mean for decades you're not going to know really. Whereas for low iron, like for sure something is off. You feel very fatigued. Like it's beyond obvious that something is wrong. At least it's pretty. I think there's a marked difference between being in an adequate state and then also anemic. Like you could tell pretty clearly, but those are the things you would look to is fatigue, shortness of breath, dizziness, stuff like that. So I think that's pretty critical to look at because if you are bleeding regularly and then also having a like a B vitamin deficient, iron deficient diet as well, like that could lead to a constellation of things that you're just chronically iron deficient and in a perpetual state of like fatigue, more or less. So yeah, I think those, hopefully that's sufficient.
Dude, that's super comprehensive. I have one more question. If we had to look at women who are peri or postmenopausal, would you have a different fifth marker outside of iron that you might recommend? A hormonal, like something to look at for them that might be relevant to improving their energy, improving their mood, improving their performance? Is there something, or improving their health overall? A woman who's peri or postmenopausal that you would look at?
Yeah, like, I suppose it would depend on if they are or aren't on HRT. And okay. in general, let's say somebody is peri or postmenopausal and on HRT, because in general, that's what we would recommend rather than operating in a state of hormone deficiency for the rest of your life, which is a terrible state to be in typically. Yeah. I suppose thyroid value could be of great utility. So maybe a baseline TSH, just to see where you stand. Because at least with women, especially, estrogen seems to have a pretty significant role in spiking autoimmune issues. So you're almost, the prevalence of autoimmune related thyroid abnormalities is way higher in women than in men. So I would say, in general, having an assessment of that would be worthwhile to see where your thyroid status is, because that could be just as problematic as being, anemic almost for your quality of life on a daily basis if you're in a state of a sluggish thyroid where you are not partitioning nutrients properly, you have low resting heart rate, you're cold all the time. Like the symptoms from low thyroid are pretty apparent and suck. And oftentimes it can go totally overlooked because it's a more insidious thing that sometimes might not be parsed out without looking at thyroid values. So, I would love to say one marker for thyroid is great, but TSH, I know, you can only learn so much from that. But I would say if I had to pick one marker for the thyroid, I suppose free T3 maybe.
Okay.
Which is like the active thyroid hormone that imparts biologic activity in the body. And yeah, that number is typically not going to be where it needs to be if you have the upstream issues that I talked about. So I'm sure if I gave it more thought, I could think of a better fifth marker, but that is...
No, that's super helpful. It's a good one just to give thought to. And also it opens the door to a discussion around HRT. Can you talk about that? We could talk about it for both men and for women, but like starting off with women, it's a topic that from my perspective is very incendiary within the industry, and also there's a lot of misinformation around it. Can you just give a primer on like what it is, who it's for, who might benefit from it, and go from there?
Yeah. So HRT stands for hormone replacement therapy. And oftentimes it is thought to be something that men do to replace testosterone as they get older, which it is. But for women, it's becoming more and more commonly understood that it's arguably of even greater importance for them to evaluate if they're a candidate and probably almost inevitably get on it if they want optimal quality of life in once they hit menopause. Because unlike men, which we have a steady decline, it can be precipitous, but it also is not something that bottoms out to essentially nothingness. Like you could be in your 70s with a reasonable testosterone level still. With women, once you hit menopause, your estrogen and progesterone levels like plummet. Like they go to near nothingness, which is thought to be the underlying reason or a big cause of why heart disease rates skyrocket in menopause. And it is critical for bone health, cardiovascular health, offsetting neurodegeneration. Estrogen, progesterone, I would say are also the risks around them are becoming more understood as overblown when it comes to the evaluation of cancer causing potential. A lot of those studies were based on relative risk and not absolute risk.
Got it.
And also not using bioidentical hormones, which you almost can't even then speak to the data as legitimate at that point because you're talking about synthetic drugs that mimic these hormones that you would make. So when I say synthetic, I mean an estrogen that is not the same as the estrogen you make in your body. It is one that does similar things in the body, but it is not the identical one to what your body would naturally produce. So having that in check, or at least maintained at a physiologic, natural level after that otherwise plummeting of them, can sustain that cardiovascular support, neurological health, and bone integrity especially. It's very difficult to maintain that in old age if you don't have the hormonal support. You could do everything right from a lifestyle perspective, diet perspective, sleep hygiene, and if your hormones are in the gutter, which unfortunately post-menopause, like you really don't have a choice about essentially, you are at extreme risk for these things skyrocketing. So yeah, I would say with estrogen, it's critical for a lot of these, for supporting those three things in particular, but also a myriad of other things in the body. And for that, working with a professional especially is of critical importance, I would say, because it's not something to cowboy on your own. You can't really you can't really naturally fix it either, unfortunately. So if you are experiencing symptoms, hot flashes, like it's, I would say, especially time to go get a panel and kind of see if you're a candidate, and kind of where your LH and FSH levels are at, which is the signaling from your brain to actually produce these hormones, because these will actually indicate how far along you are perimenopausal in perimenopause to actually progressing to full blown. With men and HRT, it's a little bit more simple in that you are symptomatic or not, and some of it might be psychological, some of it might not. This is to be parsed out, but in general, we assess testosterone levels, also downstream estrogen that comes from the testosterone, which is critical for all the same things in men as it is in women. As weird as that might sound to many people, estrogen is critical in both men and women for many of the same reasons. And low testosterone levels increase all-cause mortality. They are basically maintaining them in an adequate level is pretty critical for muscle, body comp, brain health, but also quality of life, libido, a myriad of things. And if you were a candidate or not kind of depends on your actual capacity to produce it to begin with, but also even within that, if the number on paper looks good, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be symptomatic. Like, you could still have symptoms even if the number on paper looks good, and treatment might still be warranted. And that's kind of where the more nuanced interpretation of what's going on could be worthwhile. And the key marker for that, I think, is free testosterone, not total, because for total, you can see the total production, which is important, but the free testosterone is what is actually available to be used in the body for imparting its activity. So you could have total testosterone that looks good, but be symptomatic and have low T for years solely because you have it all bound up by proteins in the body and rendered unusable, essentially. So having that free testosterone assessed, I think, is worthwhile for men, and then also your capacity to produce via the brain, the LH and FSH, similar to women. So I would say, as far as HRT, that's kind of a primer on the main underpinnings of why it's important to have adequate hormone levels. That was a complete failure to get granular on what it does, at a high level, that's kind of like the meat and potatoes, I would say.
That was unbelievably helpful. One question I have in regard to testosterone and free testosterone versus total testosterone: is there a way to increase your free testosterone, or are there ways, I should say, to increase your free testosterone to sort of like unbind it without necessarily HRT, without necessarily testosterone supplementation? Like, is there a way to do that outside of simply injecting testosterone?
Yeah, in general, the elevations in binding proteins we see, and this is equally important in women. Like, women might be tuning out now and thinking, oh, like, this is just for the men now, I'll skip ahead. Like, no, free testosterone is critical for you. And often, a lot of women who are on combined oral contraceptives at a young age, they have a plummeting of their testosterone, but more proportionally, their free testosterone goes in the gutter, because when they take the pill, the liver spikes the production of these proteins and then binds up the suppressed hormones that they even residually had. So their testosterone that was already suppressed from the oral contraceptive they're on is even less impactful at that reduced level, because more of it's being bound up proportionally by the SHBG, is what it's called, the primary one, that basically holds it in cargo, and you are manually spiking the holding of this testosterone via oral contraceptives. So with women, oftentimes they have hindered sex drive, or even body composition can deteriorate when on to some capacity while on birth control, depending on the person. These are thought to be a consequence of just, either aging or the medication they're on, but they often don't realize like the underlying root of it. And that's a big thing, I think, of note, is the combined oral contraceptives will essentially guaranteed wreck your free testosterone levels for women.
I had not heard that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, like upwards of 70-80% reductions in free T, which is like,
wow, that's
ruthless
insane
for a girl who's developing and otherwise, yeah. So, and then for men with free T as well, I would say the most impactful things are going to be diet and lifestyle when it comes to what could be actually manipulating the number. So the more the most common cause of high SHBG that lowers free test in men is probably calorie deprivation, under recovery, and excessive exercise is probably less common, but it can cause it as well. But when you are calorie deprived to trying to lose mass amounts of fat, you are kind of manually putting yourself in a state of excess expenditure manually to lose the fat. If you go too aggressive, you can spike this protein, and even though your test levels are going down via the deprivation of nutrients in itself, similar to the women on the contraceptives, you are then also binding up more of that reduced testosterone via this kind of like liver elevation of binding proteins. Because oftentimes the body is trying to compensate to hold on to the test because you are reducing the nutrients needed to actually sustain adequate hormone levels. So it's like, okay, I need to increase the binding proteins to hold on to it now because this guy is starving himself to death. So that's where the binding proteins can elevate. And in men, I think the most impactful thing is eating enough calories of nutritious, high quality foods, ideally, as well as ensuring there's a good balance of macronutrients. So if you are in a keto diet, for example, and you are not eating carbohydrates whatsoever, huge spike in SHBG, which will bind up a lot of your testosterone.
Wow.
So like guys doing the carnivore diet, for example, I'm not to say that that diet doesn't have utility, but if there's not a cyclical implementation of carbs, at least intermittently, you can fully expect that despite having high total test levels, like your free test is probably much lower than it should be proportionally.
Dude, that's pretty crazy. Are you going to get the carnivore people coming after you for saying that now?
I don't think so. 'Cause I've talked about it before, and sometimes they're not thrilled about it, but I mean, like, it's kind of hard to dispute when, like, just show us your blood work, like, I don't know.
Do you think a lot of those people are taking exogenous testosterone, which so they might not actually believe it? Because I would imagine the carnivore crowd tends to be the people who are often more on that, and maybe even in super physiological doses. So
Yeah, it depends for sure. But I have seen even some of the most notable proponents of a carnivore diet kind of change their approach to it and start to implement carbs once they start to actually have enough regular blood work showing, my free thyroid levels, because these binding proteins don't just apply for testosterone. Like they bind sex hormones as well as other hormones. Like they work to hold stuff in cargo, and this will elevate your the actual binding of your thyroid hormones as well, and lower your free T3. Like there are things to be noted that are not just testosterone related in this nature too. And yeah, oftentimes you'll see kind of a pivot to where it's more like from carnivore purist to kind of more animal based with, fruit, honey, whatever it is, to kind of have a more, and ultimately a lot of them just, if they don't have significant autoimmune issues, kind of almost congregate ending up at a balanced diet.
Shocking. I know they start off at this very sensationalistic, very extremist point of view, and then they're like, oh, maybe more of a balanced approach is probably the best option.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this: in terms of, because what you've really done here is highlight how important it is to get blood work done and to understand the blood work. How often would you recommend getting blood work taken?
I think it depends on what the blood work shows, because if you have some glaring health issues, it would be worthwhile to get more frequent blood work until it's kind of rectified, and then you are kind of just keeping tabs on it, more or less. I think to start though, annually once a year, I would say is kind of bare minimum. And then if you have more specific needs, or you have glaring issues, like you're literally type 2 diabetic and you're trying to correct it, for example, or to get your ApoB under control because you have, familial hypercholesterolemia, which is like an extreme genetic predisposition to high atherogenic particles, ApoB. you might need to check it sooner just to see that the changes you're making are impactful and bringing it down, because these things can actually change pretty quickly. Contrary to popular belief, some people think you need to be doing this stuff for years before it fixes itself, but you can make pretty dramatic changes in your blood work just via small diet manipulations and lifestyle changes very quickly. So I would say, in general, annual, once a year, is minimum, and then biannually, I think, pretty much covers the majority of people, but maybe unnecessary, especially for younger people or people who had a good result and have an otherwise consistent lifestyle and diet. Like, annually is more than enough, I would say. But yeah, if you're getting overseen by a professional too and being medicated, I would say biannually is, I think, the legal requirement to actually maintain your medications too. So
Oh, interesting. Okay.
yeah, like if you're on hormone replacement therapy, you need to be seen biannually and get your bloods assessed.
And biannually, just for everyone listening, that means twice a year. That's not every other, because I know some people, like, they'll say like bi-weekly and they think that means every other week.
Right.
I'm like, no, it's 2 times a year, so once every 6 months.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Now, in terms of, let's talk about, and I know this changes based on the individual and it changes on what's going on with their individual blood work, but let's just say general population data, general population major issues. What are some of the most important lifestyle changes that you would recommend for the average individual to improve their overall health, especially looking at blood markers? Like, what are some of the simplest, lowest hanging fruit, most impactful things someone can do to improve their health and blood markers?
I would say getting adequate amount but also quality of sleep is kind of the underpinnings for setting you up for the next day to actually have a successful day with maximum willpower to actually do the exercise and stuff too and stick to your diet, as well as the maximized insulin sensitivity that you can via your recovery at night, at least, and all the hormones you produce while you're sleeping.
So you're basically telling new parents that they're just screwed.
Well, one thing that is tough is often in podcasts you'll hear people say how important sleep is. You need to dial it in if you're screwing it up, like you're hurting yourself so badly. But it's like everyone deals with their own, to varying degrees, levels of ability to get this, and it is one of the major underpinnings, but it's not a make or break to where if you have a kid waking up in the middle of the night constantly, you might have to be a little bit more dialed in your other areas to kind of offset that otherwise inevitable but like notable detriment to the other things. But like in balance, if you can be pretty, like 8 out of 10 on pretty much everything, like the meat and potatoes is going to cover you for the most part. It would be great if you get higher quality sleep and adequate duration, but if you can't, the other stuff will still move the needle significantly. It just might be a little bit more than the next guy who's single and has the, like rare ability to just sleep as much as he wants, whenever he wants, kind of thing.
Just don't be like scrolling Instagram and TikTok at 2 a.m. and complaining that you're not like, you need TRT, you need all this stuff. It's like, no, like, how about you try going to bed at a reasonable hour and put your fucking phone down first?
Yeah. I think that's kind of, there's a lot of people that I think will look to the kind of exotic solution and spend a bunch of time learning about things that are 1% factors, when at the end of the day, the sleep, the exercise, and the diet is the meat and potatoes of your health. So if you can be like, as close to optimized in those areas, but even if you fall short of that in one of 3 of them or something, you will still achieve the majority, a significant chunk of the outcome that you are seeking, and oftentimes avoid the need to even use some of the stuff you might deem as necessary, like testosterone replacement therapy in young age, for example. There's a lot of men that think they need it. Oh, I hear all the time, endocrine disruptors, my plastic water bottle is killing me. It's impossible to have a normal test level, so I must need hormones right now because I had a 350 total testosterone one time. It's like, no, this is a Maybe not. You have a snapshot, again, snapshot in time of your blood work right now. But like, how many readings have you had? Do you have actual symptoms? Have you actually tried to optimize these areas of your life? Even losing weight in itself can be a huge positive influence on hormones, because even if you have perfect sleep and like perfect quality diet, if you're overeating, which might be hard to do if it's a perfect quality diet, but let's just say you're overweight, the fat itself will actually disproportionately increase your estrogen production, which will tell your brain to make less of the signaling hormones that make the testosterone. So losing weight in itself has like a dramatic improvement on blood pressure reductions, testosterone levels, up to a certain point, but I don't think anyone is going to diet themselves to 7% shredded
accidentally.
Here.
Yeah. No, definitely not on this podcast.
Yeah, so in general, yeah, like, more sleep and better sleep to the capacity that you can. And I think, fortunately, it's pretty simple to do the things that at least can produce high quality sleep. It is, cold enough room, try and black it out if you can and not have a bunch of lights or sounds blaring if possible. If you need to have like a sleep mask on because you can't get blackout blinds, that's a hack that I find quite useful, especially when I'm traveling. And for some people, not eating right before they go to bed. For some people, it can be helpful to have a carb containing meal close to bed because it helps with serotonin and whatnot and melatonin production. But ultimately, most people eating within an hour a heavy meal will impede their sleep and raise their body temperature. So trying to cut off your eating window a couple hours before bed, I would say, is pretty solid. And yeah, like if you can get the high quality sleep, that has a huge impact on all the other stuff. And then the exercise, not that intensive as people might think. Getting enough steps per day, I think it's kind of the underpinnings of energy expenditure to actually maintain body comp. And then the strength training to build muscle and actually ensure when you're losing weight or gaining muscle that it's like proportionally you're going in the right direction when it's like a muscle to fat ratio. So like when you're losing weight, you want to, especially if you're on GLP-1 medication or something of that nature, having the strength training in there is pretty critical to ensure that it's mostly muscle that you are keeping or building if you're in a surplus. So I think strength training too, to offset in old age issues that could crop up, having that bank up of muscle build and bone strength that is much more difficult to build up the base of in old age, having that as young as possible is kind of your reservoir or bank to kind of lead you into a successful elderly phase of your life, essentially. And go ahead.
This is controversially what you're saying is sleep well, eat well, and lift. Right? Sleep, eat, lift, and move is really like the major things people have to do over years and years and years. That's like the most important things.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. And to me, I feel like the step count too is pretty important to note, in that a lot of people, they think of cardio as this thing that needs to be a dedicated block of time on certain days that they dread and is on a treadmill or something. But there's a way to integrate it into your lifestyle that makes the cardio like your actual life. Like there are ways to get the steps without having to go stand on a step mill or a treadmill for 45 minutes every second day or something, trying to hit your weekly steps and counting them up. Rather, you just kind of want to build a lifestyle that is conducive to achieving the step count target, I would say, without having to like go way out of your way to do blocks of cardio that you dread. So ultimately integrating it into a sustainable lifestyle where you're doing, like in total, a couple hours per week at least of strength training in total. I'm not sure what the minimum effective number is there. I can't recall off the top of my head. That might be a better question for you to address. But 7,500 to 10,000 steps per day, I think is pretty solid. And the sleep, some of the things I mentioned there are, and then also just avoiding smoking, limiting alcohol, I think are pretty self-explanatory. And I think those are kind of the heavy hitters.
I appreciate it. I think it always helps just to have someone, especially as intelligent as yourself, like reiterate these things. And I've said for years, man, my greatest investment, one of my greatest, I can't say it's the greatest, one of my greatest investments in my health in the past 5 years has just been a walking pad. Just to have and especially for people who work in an office or even people who are stay-at-home parents and they're at home, just having something it's not as big and bulky as a treadmill. You can relatively easily move it around. It's not nearly as expensive, and you could just, whether you're watching TV, on a phone call, they're quiet. Having a walking pad is so damn easy to get steps in. And what we got for my wife's grandfather, we got a little he has neuropathy actually, and he can't do standing very well. So we got him a little pedal, a seated pedal that he can do sitting at the couch or just putting under the dining room table, so he can just pedal. Just finding ways to get movement in. It doesn't even have to be super stressful. I think is one of the ultimate ways to improve health. So I love that. I have a question. Do you have a hard stop at an hour? Because I do have a question that's going to open up a can of worms.
Oh no, I'm good, man.
Okay, so one thing I wanted to talk about, because you brought up very briefly GLP-1s. I want to talk about those. They're obviously a major topic of discussion right now. I think they are massively misunderstood. Now, I'll give you my initial thoughts, and then I want you to take over and tell me if I'm wrong, not wrong, whatever. I think that they're obviously not for everybody. Clearly. I also think that they are a legitimate miracle, and that they are for the people who need them. They are doing things that for years and years and years, we've always we wish something like this could exist. Now I also know they're not brand new. It's not like they just came out a couple years ago. They've been around for a little bit now, but I think that it's overwhelmingly clear that they are extraordinary for those who need them. And the way that I think about them at this point is I don't even necessarily think about them solely as weight loss drugs. I think about them as food noise drugs. They help you stop thinking about it as much. It helps you have I think an unhealthy relationship with food is one in which you're constantly thinking about it. And a lot of these people who really struggle with food are constantly thinking about it. And so GLP-1s, one of the things of the many things they can do is just help you stop thinking about it all the time, which will then have so many positive health effects. So I'm going to shut up now. I want your thoughts on GLP-1s, primer, education, who should, who shouldn't, just go off and riff.
Yeah, it's tough because obviously when they were initially designed, they were for diabetics to manage their condition. And then over time, it extended into obesity management. And then over time, it has evolved into this almost cosmetic kind of, even if you want to lose 5 to 10 pounds for the beach, let's get on this. And it's tough to say where the line should be drawn as to if the ROI is positive or not, because oftentimes the people who would even do it for vanity purposes would have otherwise used something worse mechanistically, like heavy stimulant abuse. In the fitness industry, I've even seen people take up smoking to suppress their appetite. It's crazy some of the stuff people do. And over time that's evolved to heavy vape use as opposed to actual cigarettes, but
which is still terrible for you.
Yeah. So, and that's not to say you couldn't achieve your goals without it. I'm not to say, oh, you're going to be on a drug no matter what, so just use it. That's absolutely not what I'm saying, because there's certainly strategies that are natural that I think go overlooked now that can put you in a conducive state to having an ideal diet and not having to expose yourself to the willpower compromising situations. Just not having that stuff in your house to begin with is the number one strategy I've found personally. But for people who have diabetes and have a clinical warranted need for it, it's unquestionably makes sense for them to continue their medication if prescribed by a doctor. And for obesity management in general, I would say the data suggests pretty strongly that the weight loss that you get from it outweighs whatever potential risks there might be. But that's not to say there's no risks, and it's still kind of unknown. Fortunately, there's more long-term within the short scope that they've been invented, but like longer than people might otherwise think, because it's been used for a while in diabetics. It's not rigorously studied for dozens of decades necessarily, but we're reasonably certain that it's not going to cause significant issues for somebody with obesity trying to manage it that would even come close to compare to the havoc that being obese has on human health. So it's almost like with those individuals, I don't even know if there's a point of me getting granular and trying to identify if you've tried, like there are certainly strategies that are worth implementing that I'm sure you discuss at length on your channel. I don't want to deviate the discussion into all the strategies I would look to before implementing a GLP-1, but there are plentiful.
Yeah. I talk about that all the time on my channel.
Okay.
And everything. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say, let's just say you've tried and exhausted all those and you are on a GLP-1 as an obese person, totally worthwhile, I think, based on the data. So we're kind of looking at like, a average person, is it worthwhile for kind of like to optimize? Because some people could still improve their insulin sensitivity, even if they're not seen as like traditionally obese, or improve just like their visual appearance and whatnot. For those people, there's technically not a warranted clinical utility for it because it's not prescribed for that. So that in itself could exclude people, but also the risk profile. That is a tougher one for me to say with any certainty that it is or isn't, because some of the unknown stuff is a little bit iffy. Like one of the things not often talked about is the increase in heart rate. This is outlined in the drug pamphlet info, but it is discussed in the context of somebody who is losing a lot of weight. They will typically still see, on average, like increases in resting heart rate, even in individuals who are losing lots of weight, which is that's pretty significant in my opinion, because like in general, if you're losing lots of weight, it has a pretty strong impact on your blood pressure reductions and resting heart rate. So the fact that it could still net out an increase despite the fact that you might be losing significant amounts of weight is, I think, not to be ignored. And
Agreed.
Even in personal experience, like I have experimented with them, for similar reasons that I just said might not make sense for sure. And
I want to know, like, if you're discussing them, it's helpful to experiment just so you can have that experience.
And one thing I can say with certainty is anytime I've been on semaglutide or tirzepatide, there is a blatant jump in 5 to 10 beats per minute of my resting heart rate. Like,
that's so interesting.
I can't get around it no matter what. I see it just like, I track my sleep metrics and my metrics on a daily basis, and my resting heart rate will go from like 50 to 60 every time, no matter what.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you see a difference? Is there a negative impact on your blood pressure or just your heart rate?
Blood pressure seems to be similar, but the resting heart rate is unavoidable, like no matter what I do. And it typically, this is not uncommon to see in people who are using it too, like common anecdotes of 5+ beats per minute increase in resting heart rate. That's not to say that increase is bad though, because if you have a significant amount of caffeine on a daily basis, you could argue it does the same thing and also increases blood pressure. But the data would suggest that caffeine is often a neutral or even a positive in the grand scheme of things when it comes to body composition and health. So
even health up to like 400 milligrams a day, like, should be totally fine.
Yeah, and that's like literally a CNS stimulant designed to impede sleep. So with this thing, like, it's not impeding the sleep process. It doesn't bleed into something that would otherwise need to be cleared to actually get the restful quality recovery. So it's like, is that a net negative? And then there's the thyroid cancer discussion, which, in rats has shown to be concerning. At least in humans, it hasn't played out to any meaningful degree. That seems to be in itself criteria that you should not use it if you could net benefit from the weight loss at all. But I think it's a consideration if you have a thyroid cancer in your family history, for sure, if that's something that you want to be potentially enhancing the risk profile for when you're already at risk as is, because there's certainly a case to be made that it's certainly not gonna help in that area.
We haven't seen it in humans yet, or have we?
Not to a meaningful enough degree that anyone could say with certainty it's going to enhance your risk. At least
Okay.
that's what I've seen. And this is
Okay.
like as recent as 2024. So yeah, man, like, I think in general, it's kind of the goal you have, what the outcome benefit wise from a health perspective could be, but also like how much of this is for vanity versus actual metrics of health that will improve quality of life too. And, working with a professional to oversee it too, because trying to interpret this stuff and the impact it's having in other areas of your life and your health status can be difficult and nuanced, especially with this ever developing class of drugs that becomes more and more refined over time as well. And having a professional, like, that's why typically I would recommend with working with somebody at Marek Health if you're going to be using a medication like this, because they understand and stay on top of the nuanced, new cutting edge research that's coming out around, is this an increase in sympathetic drive? And over time, it's actually going to increase your risk for cardiovascular disease if you're somebody who didn't really need that much weight to lose to begin with, or who knows. Or even assessing if your baseline state is worthwhile of the risk profile from a thyroid cancer perspective, because you might have no idea. You might even have to modulate your drug intake of if you're on thyroid meds, like that might have to change based on if you're going to take a GLP-1 now as well. So yeah, there's a lot of considerations to be had, and not just blindly get on it because you hear it's the next greatest thing ever that's going to improve the health of everyone. But to that point too, it is a class of drugs that's remarkable, as you said, and for the right candidate can be exceptionally net positive, I would say.
I love that. It's important for me to bring that up and to have a nuanced discussion around it, because so much of what I'm seeing on social media is rage bait, anger, guilting, shaming, often either like people who use it are cheating, which I always laugh. It's like, cheating at what? Like, this isn't a competition, number one. But dude, I even get messages. I got a message from a woman within the last 48 hours. And this has happened like with many, especially women, but numerous times within the last, 6 to 8 months. But literally within the last 48 hours, a woman told me that she's been on them secretively, and she has a fair amount of weight to lose, but her husband literally said, and I couldn't literally said like, he's one of the kind of guys, she said, that like any type of whether it's Botox or whether it's like anything that you do to your body, like he'd be like, I would divorce. I'm like, well, that's wild. That's like insane in of itself. But she literally has to keep it secret because he thinks it's cheating. He thinks you shouldn't do it. And for me, it's like, man, these are such extremist views. And I don't know anyone who actually is knowledgeable on the topic who has an extremist view. It's only people who have a very one-sided, propaganda-based, it's Dunning-Kruger like personified, where it's like essentially nothing about it, but you think you know everything, and you're willing to make these outrageously crazy decisions based on what you think you know. And so I think having these nuanced discussions around it, it's great for some people. They really are a scientific miracle. It's definitely not for everyone, and there are risks to be aware of. I think it's really important so that we can have more conversations around it and be educated. So I appreciate that point of view.
One thing I did forget to mention, which is probably the most important caveat of GLP-1 use as well, is potential for muscle loss. So this is often talked about as if it will induce literal melting of your muscle, which is not the case. The drug doesn't do this. However, what it will do, because it significantly reduces appetite, it could reinforce bad eating behaviors at a proportionally lower scale, where you're now not only lowering the intake of calories to a point where you're losing weight, but if you don't actually improve the quality of the diet to something that is more reflective of supporting of body composition, you could just end up stripping a disproportionate amount of muscle off your frame while also losing fat. So for obese people, oftentimes there's so much fat to lose that it's kind of like a moot point. But for the better the body composition baseline is, the more notable this fact is that if you take it and don't make any changes to your diet, or at least if it wasn't a baseline diet that was reflective of adequate protein intake and you didn't have the strength training bench like underpinnings as well, you could lose a significant amount of muscle mass while losing the weight and end up in a, you know, if you're especially in older age, like perhaps like a different but still compromised state.
That makes total sense. Now, at this point, briefly want to talk about Marek and how. So I'm very excited to be working with Marek as an opportunity to give people another opportunity to have access to get blood work done and get care that maybe they're not seeing from their own healthcare provider. Now, I posted about it on my Instagram recently because I don't do partnerships. Like, I don't do them. Like, I've been in this industry posting online since 2011. I work with a supplement company that I've used for years, long before I started working with them, and now I work with Marek, and that's it. And I think that's why people took it seriously. And dude, the response was amazing.
Dude, hugely positive response.
Massively
Crazy.
Positive, thousands and thousands of people. And I think it's because they know, number one, I don't do partnerships, but number two is I talk about getting your blood work done and being aware of your health markers all the time. Like, this is something that could not be more in line with what I believe in. And before I partnered with Marek, I went through the process of work, and I'm still working with them. Bro, what you guys are doing is amazing. Like, I've been so blown away with the level of care, with the with not only the accuracy, but just the level of care that I feel as a patient. I've had, and there are some people, there were maybe, I think I got like 4 negative people, like 4 actually, out of literally thousands, which is amazing, an amazing data point, because I could say on a post like, hey, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and I'll get 100 people who are pissed. But like, so just for like 4 people are upset, was a very good data point. Now, some people are very lucky to have wonderful opportunities with their healthcare provider, with their doctors, and their doctors have no issues getting their blood work taken and analyzing it with them. But man, the number of people who reached out and told me their doctors don't listen to them, their doctors don't get blood work done. I even had, this was actually really interesting, one of the 4 people who were initially upset with me, she messaged me, and she's a provider. She's a medical provider. And she was like, well, the issue is and she sent me voice memos, by the way. So I saved all of them because I couldn't believe that this actually came out. She was like, they should only be working with their doctor. They shouldn't be going to a service like this. And I was like, well, in my opinion, I think every single person should have the right and the ability to know what's going on with their health. And they should be able to choose what they do with their body and find out about the blood, like what's going on with their body, and they shouldn't have to fight for it. Like, it should be readily available. And she said this, dude, I couldn't believe it. I have the voice memos recorded. She said, well, I understand what you're saying, but a lot of times doctors are opened up to lawsuits by doing that. And so one of my doctors, for example, he won't order blood work because he doesn't want to open up Pandora's box. And I said, like, you just made my point for me. Like, yeah. This doctor won't order blood work for his patients because he doesn't want to open up Pandora's box. You're potentially harming people. And I'm not saying this is the norm. There are so many amazing doctors. I'm not saying this is the norm. But what I am saying is, Marek, for me, opened up an opportunity to keep track of my health and my blood work that is significantly easier and more convenient and more affordable than I've ever found anywhere else. And that's why I've been so excited to partner with them. Do you want to explain what Marek is from your, like, how you work with them? Like, what's your role with Marek and all of that?
Yeah. And first and foremost, like, so stoked to hear that that's your experience. And, couldn't have put it better, man. Like, that is amazing to hear and makes me very grateful and also proud of the team we have and what we're doing, because that's been the mission from day one, is providing high quality oversight for preventative medicine and getting access to that. Ultimately, my motivation stemmed from issues that you just described, having to beg almost to get certain things checked, and the relative lack of proactive approach to health management and optimization is it's very difficult sometimes and often completely discouraging to get shunned away or even shamed when you are trying to take control of your situation and be proactive about things. So my own issues with that for my family and myself motivated me to find the avenue to try and bring this to the masses, not just so I and my family can have access to it too, but so I could bring it to people who follow my stuff and hopefully educate at scale about the importance of tackling this stuff early and getting non-judgmental oversight and how impactful it can be on quality of life and hopefully longevity at the end of the day too. So Marek ultimately stemmed from my desire to bring that preventative medicine to as many people as possible and just give the opportunity to, if you want to, take care of this stuff in a proactive manner. Like, we are one of the go-to places for that offers high quality, hands-on preventative medicine with medical professionals that are on the cutting edge. And you can tell when you speak to them too, highly passionate about the subject matter. They didn't just go to school to get the certified to practice. Rather, they actually even follow this stuff themselves as a fan too. Like, they will follow the content creators and the medical professionals in their specific fields that are literally doing the research to advance, lipid management metrics and how to most optimally manage patients from a insulin sensitivity perspective. Like, all these things are not just emphasized for the sake of providing care to the capacity that they deem high quality when they became a doctor, but also to further educate themselves over time to stay on the cutting edge, to know that they're providing the highest quality of care to their patients at that time. So that makes me incredibly proud of what we're doing, and is also a big component of our screening process to determine who gets in to actually represent us and sees the patients. So with us, when you were working with us, you're getting not only the most advanced diagnostics with the most cutting edge metrics that reflect the most comprehensive insights into your health status, but also the hyper nuanced interpretation of those diagnostics to get the most accurate picture of what's going on and how to optimize moving forward. And I believe very strongly in what we're doing, and it's my goal to bring awareness to it to as many people as possible.
Do you ever get any pushback on it? Like, is there any negative stuff that you get from people who haven't actually gone through the service?
Yeah, I would say sometimes it's, you're not a doctor, why are you talking about this stuff? And it's ultimately, I'm not providing any.
You're not the provider. Yeah.
So I am a face of the company. I bring the message to the masses in as scalable of a fashion as I can, which I feel like I'm reasonably capable of doing, fortunately, and have been relatively successful to date at doing. But ultimately, you are going to be seen by a professional who is qualified, certified, and at the cutting edge of the stuff, and reflects the values and principles that the company stands for at the end of the day. And ultimately, no one is going to force somebody through this service. It's something you have to want yourself. And if you feel it's worth the money, then that we're here for you. If you want to utilize our services, and we have free discovery calls where you can see if we're a right fit for you before you go down the rabbit hole of investing a significant amount of time or money into this process. But ultimately, our clientele are those who want to take control and get those comprehensive insights, to get the rigorous oversight and know that they are doing what they need to do to be preventative and to feel good that they are making the strides towards either optimizing quality of life or rectifying a inadequate state of health. And if we're not qualified to handle a certain area, we're humble enough to defer people to where to get that oversight as well. So that is notable too. We don't pretend to be experts in areas that we're not, and we will absolutely send people to cardiologists when warranted and whatnot, and have a very strong referral network in place to ensure that everyone gets seen by the proper professionals for their particular situation, but it's also just the nuance in identifying what that person needs that we're so great at too.
Let me tell you really quick the tipping point that really made me decide I wanted to partner with Marek. So I was already having a great service and a really wonderful experience. The tipping point was many people, and myself included, thought like, okay, you go into one of these services, they're just going to push testosterone on me because I'm a dude. I was fully expecting to be like, because one of the many panels that was taken was testosterone, and it wasn't bad by any means. It was like high fives, low sixes in that range, like for total, and I forget where free was, but like it was fine. And I'm 33, and I want to have more kids, and so personally, I just don't really want to go on testosterone right now. Now, I didn't say anything because I knew this was like a potential to work together. I wanted to just only hear what the professional was talking about and hear their opinion. They said from the beginning, they were like, I don't really think you need to go on testosterone. They're like, I think there's a lot that we can do if we want to do it naturally. There are some lifestyle interventions that we can change. If you want to talk about like supplements, like natural supplements you can take if you'd like to. But I don't really think there's a need for you to go on testosterone. Bro, I had the biggest sense of relief when they said that, because I've heard of so many experiences with other companies where they just push testosterone on people and any drugs that people don't actually need. And so to have that level of honesty and integrity right off the bat, especially, I think it would have made sense for them to think like, okay, male, young 30s, fitness industry, he's probably going to want testosterone. So I think it would make sense from a money perspective to say, hey, let's get him on test. The exact opposite. That pushed me over the edge. Whereas like that's high level integrity and really I was very clear. I was like, listen, I've had genetically high blood pressure. Like, and I for them to say right off the bat, you don't need it, we don't want you to go on it. It let me know that y'all are doing the right thing and your goal is right, and your goal to try and help people and bring light to this world and help people take their own health into their own hands. Man, I've been super impressed, and I don't say that lightly.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that, man. And yeah, it's one of the stereotypes of hormone replacement therapy companies, or TRT clinics, as many will call them too, is that ultimately you're going to come in, get given a cookie cutter prescription, and then get sent out the door. That is often actually what happens, but we do not push medications unnecessarily on anybody, and we pride ourselves on our service and working with each individual to do what we can within the capacity of natural means, whether it be diet, lifestyle, supplementation, sleep hygiene, manipulations, etc., to dial things as much as possible before ever exposing somebody to what could otherwise be a lifelong reliance on a medication. Because that's a significant commitment to make to yourself, to be on something that like shuts down your hormones for life. We want to make sure you have all the full picture before you go into something like that, and have taken all steps, and at least informed too with reasonable insights and depth why you might be in the state you're in and ways you could otherwise attenuate it or rectify it entirely before you go the artificial synthetic hormone route. When I say synthetic, I mean exogenous, like outside source, not that the drug is synthetic, to be clear. So yeah, I'm glad to hear that's your experience, and should be what people expect when they come work with us as well. As we're not going to push things unnecessarily on you. We're not going to put you on TRT because you had one 400 total T one time. There's more granular insight to get into, and ultimately when medication is warranted, it's absolutely consideration, and you can be rest assured that we have the highest level of professionals on our team to oversee that implementation of that medication and make sure you don't mess yourself up using it. But ultimately, all the measures possible to try and dial things in to get you in the best optimal state for natural function is a priority, and we pride ourselves on too. So,
man, Derek, thank you so much. I'm going to put a link to Marek in the show notes and also in the description of this video. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you want to tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, so you can check out Marek Health, link in description, marekhealth.com. You can check out me anywhere. More plates, more dates. You'll find me and my content on Instagram, YouTube, etc. And appreciate you having me on, man. It was cool to connect.
Man, it was a pleasure. I'm going to hit stop recording. Don't hang up just yet. Thank you to everyone listening. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. I'll talk to you soon.